and he showed me some rivers down there, and he said we could actually land in the banana patches beside the rivers, but once again we have to fight the environment, or if we land on the river we'd probably ground loop and go over. So he suggested maybe we should just fly on into Kuching and get gas.
Would you please tell me in detail about your trip around the world?
Oh my. The things that I can tell?
Yes.
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, it started out as just a whim. I had been on call at the hospital for 24/7s, and I had it up.
What year was this?
1963. I had it up to here with being on call. I left the hospital and I drove directly to my travel agent, and I said, I want to go to Tahiti. And she said, well, that would be very interesting, and I can plan a trip for you that way. But if you would like, for the same price, I can book you to Hong Kong, which is halfway, and then you can just keep going on around the world, and you can have a complete around the world trip, which I tell you was probably the greatest thing that I ever did in my life at that age anyway. So I got on the plane in Los Angeles, and I had this stack of tickets. You know, in those days we used to have big stacks of tickets. And the stewardess asked me what my final destination was, and I said Los Angeles. And she got all excited, and she said, well, you're on the wrong plane because you're already in Los Angeles. And so we had to go through that explanation. And from then, you want to know in detail everything that happened.
From place to place to place.
Well, you know, my first stop was Hawaii, which was someplace I was familiar with, and I knew people there. And from Hawaii, I flew to Tokyo.
Well, what happened in Hawaii? I mean, anything spectacular
Hawaii
there?
was typical Hawaii. You know, you go to the beach, you have a Mai Tai, you visit Hawaii.
you see all the chickens that are out there, right?
Yeah, it was, but like I said, Hawaii was not an unusual. I've been to Hawaii a lot of times, but at that point, but, and I did have friends there too, so I was people to visit. But from Hawaii, then I flew to Tokyo, which was really very interesting because in Tokyo, a family met me at the airport, and this family their son had been sponsored to the United States a number of years before to go to school, and he had stayed with one of the guys that I worked with in Glendale, an anesthesiologist. And so he had called ahead, or written in those days, I guess he didn't call, and asked them if they would take care of me while I was in Tokyo. They picked me up at the airport, the son did, and drove me to the Imperial Hotel, which was #1 5-star hotel in Tokyo at that time. And you know, it was really nice to have somebody pick me up like that, and I thought that was a real nice gesture, and I thought that was kind of the end of the whole thing. Then they announced to me the next morning, I was down at breakfast, and the maitre d' came over and he said, your car's waiting for you. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't have a car. And he said, oh, I'm sorry. And so he went back, and then he came back a few minutes later and he said, are you Dr. Mack? And I said, yes. He said, well, the gentleman says that Mercedes out there is for you. And so after I finished eating, I went out, and it belonged to these folks that had met me at the airport. And there was a young lady there that spoke beautiful English, and she was to show me around Tokyo for a few hours. And we drove and we saw temples and all the typical things in Tokyo that you might see. And then we went to a restaurant where this family, I mean, there were about 7 or 8 people at the table sitting on the floor, typical Japanese style. And they had a luncheon for me, which was typical Japanese, which went on for probably, a couple hours total. But everything was very much according to what the normal Japanese people would do. And about halfway through, Mama-san came in on her hands and knees, sat at the head of the table, and everybody bowed to her, and they do their very formal type of thing. And Mama-san picks up a bottle of beer and drinks it. And I don't know if she had a little bit to eat or what, but then she left. She was just there for the one course. And anyway, I was very impressed with the fact that they were treating me to this wonderful luncheon. And they took me back to my hotel, and then they announced that they would be picking me up for a tea ceremony about 7 or 8 o'clock that evening. And I went to that, and after that, they took me to the Mikado, which is like the Moulin Rouge of Tokyo. And Ima Sumac, have you ever heard of Ima Sumac? She was a Peruvian girl that was found out in the jungle somewhere. She had this huge range in her voice from bass up to lyric soprano. And she put on the show there that night. Well, anyway, that was completely taken care of by these people. I had friends that were practicing medicine up in a town about an hour out of Tokyo, so the next day I had planned to go see them, and which I did. I went up on the Bullet, which was a fun train also. And when I got there, I spent the day with our friend. He was a surgeon also. And I spent the day with him and his wife and kids, and had a really nice time. When I went back to get onto the train, I went through the turnstile like always, but when I got to my destination, I couldn't get out to the turnstile. What I didn't realize is you're supposed to keep a hold of your ticket, and on the way out, you put it back into the turnstile. So I fooled around for a little bit, and then I finally jumped over the turnstile and ran like heck so nobody could catch me, and got out of there. But, so Tokyo was a real fun thing. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. Then I went to Hong Kong. Now in Hong Kong, it was really an interesting experience because I happened to be sitting in a bar of all places. You can't imagine this nice young boy was in a bar. But anyway, I was sitting in this bar, and I met a couple of Navy pilots who had trained in Mountain View, California, which happened to be my hometown, and they're on the aircraft carrier, the Oriskany, in Hong Kong. And so we kind of got commiserating, and finally there were about 12 of us. And I happened to be staying at the Peninsula Hotel on the other side of the bay from Hong Kong, and suggested if everybody wanted to come to my hotel, we could go back and have a nightcap or something, which lasted until about 7 o'clock in the morning, when all of a sudden they realized that they were within an hour of when they were supposed to be leaving on the aircraft carrier. So in the process of all of this, we had a good time. It was fun. But from Hong Kong, then I went to Bangkok. And Bangkok is called the Venice of the East. And so I did the canals and all that kind of stuff. And it was fun, but it was kind of a short stay there. I went on over to Singapore, and Singapore is just an incredibly beautiful city. Clean like you wouldn't believe. I mean,
What is it?
Singapore.
Yeah,
And
I heard that.
Extremely clean.
Oh,
They don't
okay.
even allow gum chewing in the city. I mean,
Wow.
it's forbidden. But in Singapore, I knew one of the nurses that worked at the Adventist hospital there, and she and I went down on Sago Street, which is where they have the death houses, and we wandered through a couple of those where in those days they would take people who were terminal or elderly or whatever, and they'd take them there and they gave them water, but they didn't feed them until they died, and that was there. And then downstairs they had a restaurant, and in the restaurant the whole family's down there having a party, and they made paper mache type cars and stuff and then burn them, and that was for them the deceased to take with them on their trip to wherever they were going in death and that part. And that was when we got back, we discovered that Caucasian people didn't go in that part of town, and we've been through the death houses and we've seen everything that there was to see, and but nobody killed us either. And but anyway, somebody at the hospital says, well, your cousins are missionaries in Borneo, which was just about 600 miles over water from there. And of course, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have any way to communicate with the people in Borneo. So I just flew over to Kuching, which was the capital city, and they told me now, when you get off the plane, there will be a line of taxi cabs, and they will try to work you down in the price, so don't take the first cab. So I got off the plane in Kuching. The airport was real big, probably even bigger than this room, not much, but a little bit. And I got off the plane and I went to the first taxi driver, and he spoke a few words of English, and he knew where my cousins were, 25 miles out in the jungle, and there's only one road that goes through Kuching. And he said, I can take you, but he suggested that it would be a lot of wear and tear on his car, and that he'd have to buy gas for coming back and all of that. And he finally was figuring out in his little pad there, and he said, the best I can do is $4.43 American. So I said, I think probably I'm not going to spend too much time going down the line and seeing if we can cut that, down a little bit. So anyway, we took a ride through the jungle, and all the way through the jungle, there were people along the road with machetes, cutting the jungle back because it actually just kind of will take over the road, and so they got me out to the mission station, and we pulled up in front, and my cousin's wife, Jean, was on the front porch sweeping, and she looked at me and she said, Keith, that's you. No, that's not you. Yes, it is. Keith, that's you. And I said, Jean, I don't care who it is me. So, but it's a little astounding when a boy from LA walks up to the porch in the middle of the Borneo jungle.
Really?
In a yellow cab of all things. So, but anyway, so my cousins, the two brothers out there, were both pilots. And so we flew to all these little villages where they had made little dirt runways, and flew in and out of all of that. And because of the Jakarta uprising in Malaysia, the planes were not leaving Borneo, so I was stuck on Borneo for a week. But I had some really fantastic times flying around, and that's kind of interesting. When you're flying, my cousin said, we got to get into Kuching. We're running out of gas, which I thought was pretty exciting when you're over the middle of Borneo jungle. And I suggested if we had to land, where could we land? And he said, well, we could actually go down into the trees, and it would be a rather soft landing. Probably would survive. However, a lot of them are over 100 feet high, and you got to get down to the jungle somehow. And even if you got on the ground, of course, it's full of snakes and alligators and all this type of thing. And he showed me some rivers down there, and he said we could actually land in the banana patches beside the rivers. But once again, we have to fight the environment. Or if we land on the river, we'd probably ground loop and go over. So he suggested maybe we should just fly on into Kuching and get gas. But anyhow, it was it was exciting. And then they decided the people in Borneo, they live in what they call long houses. They're built way high on stilts, and they have slats in the floor so everything drops through for the pigs and goats and animals below. Mm. So we were walking out, and they wanted me to go out and see the long houses. When we were walking through the jungle, all of a sudden one of the natives said in beautiful English, "There's a cobra." Well, and don't move. Well, I couldn't have moved if I wanted to move. I mean, so anyway, they don't kill them. Of course, they shoo them off into the jungle. And, of course, we had to come back the same way. So I'm looking for Mr. Cobra all the way back. It was not a pleasant trip back. So, but, it was only probably an hour walk out in there. So finally, the plane did come into Kuching, so I went back to Singapore, but unfortunately, then I missed, and then I flew from there to Calcutta, India, and in Calcutta, I had missed my connection, which was going to take me to Agra, where the Taj Mahal is, and where they had the burning ghats and all of this type of thing, but I was a few days short on time at that point, and I missed my flight, which happened to incidentally crash. So I was kind of glad I missed it. No, it was an Air India. Anyhow, so I spent a few days in New Delhi. And when I got ready to leave New Delhi, they weren't going to let me go through customs because I had in my wallet a narcotic license because I'm a physician. And they wanted to know about my narcotic use and this type of thing. And I tried to explain to them that this was just a license that said I could write prescriptions for narcotics. But anyhow, and then when they got through interrogating me on that, when you go into India, you have to declare every amount of money that you have with you. Then you have to have a receipt for everything that you buy while you're there. And when you leave, it has to balance. I was 8 rupees short, which I think was about 13 cents or something like that. They were going to hold me hostage in Germany or in India for a while, but they didn't. So anyway, I got on the flight, and we had an overnight flight to Tehran, and there were 6 people on a 740 or 707. So we put pillows out, and the stewardesses spent all the time pouring booze down us, forcing us to drink. And we had just a fantastic 8-hour flight to Tehran. So everybody said I had a good time. I don't know, but anyhow. From Tehran, then I went on over to Cairo. And in Cairo, once again, I had friends in the States and knew 2 doctors there. And they said that they would meet me and take me to dinner. I need to go back, though, on that just a little bit. On the flight going into Cairo, they had egg salad sandwiches. And, of course, I didn't know that they don't refrigerate or prepare things quite the way we do. So I not only had 1 egg salad sandwich, I asked for a second one. And then I spent the night on the bathroom floor, never being so sick in all my life, and I thought I was gonna die. So the next morning I got up and the bellman said, go down to the bazaar, which was just a few blocks away, and he gave me a number of a booth there, and he said that gentleman will give you something that will make you feel better. And I mean, I really thought I was dying. I went down to the bazaar, which is, you know, a really interesting part of Cairo, I guess, kind of low life of all kinds. But anyhow, I went to this booth, and this guy came out with a black syrup, and I believe it or not, I just drank it down. Within minutes, I was well. I just felt perfectly fine. So anyway, that night, the doctors that were going to take me took me out on the Sahara Desert, and it was a full moonlight night, and there was this huge tent out there. It looked just like a big circus tent, you know. And we started in the door, and when they went through the door, every direction you looked, it was nothing but crystal chandeliers and Persian tapestries, and I mean, the eating areas, they had these big copper tables, you know, with the flame in the middle, and the belly dancers. And I mean, it was quite an elegant evening. And so that was my introduction to the Sahara. And then, of course, I spent several days touring things like the pyramids and seeing the Sphinx and riding on a camel and things that everybody else does. Went down to the Valley of the Kings, which at that point they were just putting in the Aswan Dam. So they were moving everything from down around the river up. They moved the whole Valley of the King, all the monuments and everything up the hill, which was fantastic. And at the pyramids, they had what they called the light and sound. And on that, and the night I was there was all in English, which was fortunate. And they have big spotlights behind the pyramids in different colors, and they have music playing, and they tell the story of the pyramids and the Israelites and their lives there. And it was very fantastic and very interesting. Then from Cairo, I went to Athens. I was supposed to go to Jerusalem, but because of the visas, they would not okay my visa to go from Egypt at that time to Jerusalem. If we'd gone to Jerusalem first, I could have gone back to Egypt, but Israel wouldn't allow me in there. I did go to Damascus, however, and then over to Athens. And in Athens, I, of course, did the typical tourist thing of Athens and looked at the Acropolis and all that. Then I got on a ship for 8 days and went to all the Greek Isles. Well, not all of them, obviously, but all the major islands. And then up to Istanbul in Turkey. And when we got to Istanbul and pulled into the port, they said we had this big full day of touring Istanbul the next day. And I'm not real big on organized tours. So instead of going to see the mosque and Sophia and the Blue Mosque and all that, I just got on a trolley and rode clear to the end of the trolley line and then walked all the way back to the port. Spent almost all day walking. And I'd stop at little cafes and have wine and visit with people that I didn't know and couldn't speak their language, but we talked, and it was just a fun day, you know, and thoroughly enjoyed it. And then when we got to Rhodes, that was kind of an interesting experience too, because I wanted to go up to the Acropolis, and I was going to hike up there, and there's probably for 3/4 of a mile or so, not far. And so there was a man down there with donkeys, and he wanted me to rent one of his donkeys to go up to the Acropolis. So, well, I started up on the donkey, and I was about halfway there, and the streets were just little narrow streets, and this donkey was trying to rub me off on the wall on this side and on the other side. Well, I was brought up on a ranch in Northern California, and we never rode with a saddle or anything. We just jumped on these dumb horses and went. And I knew that if I dig my fingernails into his ears, he would stop. So I did that, and he sat down. I jumped off. I guess Dumbo went back where he was going. I went on up to the Acropolis, but I never saw the guy that rented him to me. But I'm sure the donkey went home again. So, but it was a really fun time. And when I came back to Athens again, they had the light and sound on the Acropolis, just like they had in Italy. And once again, it was in English, and it was very interesting. They gave all the history of the Greek Empire and all that type of thing. So from Athens, then I went to Rome, and in Rome, before I left on my trip, I had arranged for my folks to have a 3-week trip to Europe to help pay them back for all the schooling that they had given me and everything. And that was just kind of a way of saying thank you. But I didn't tell them that I was going to be in Rome when they got there. So they're on this trip, and they're just riding around, and my mother was sitting in the front of the tour bus, and I had already gone to their hotel room and everything, and so I knew approximately when they were coming in. And I happened to be standing on the street corner, and my mother looked out the window, and she said to my dad, "That's Keith on the corner." And my dad said, "Oh, Peggy, you're nuts," And he said, "Oh, that's Keith." And, here they were in Europe and had no idea I was anywhere around. And I had been going with a girl by the name of Lynn Rabino, who was studying opera there. She was from San Jose, California. And so I had dated her a little bit between San Jose and Rome, which is not really handy for dating, and. So anyway, my folks were, when we got there, then we went out to dinner with Lynn, and in a place where everybody sang, and then of course they had her sing, and she had a beautiful operatic voice, and it was just a real fun evening with my folks. Then I went to Amsterdam. Oh, I didn't really stay in Amsterdam, though. We just kind of landed in Amsterdam, and then I went to New York City and met a buddy of mine by the name of Walt Huppenbauer, who was an executive with General Motors, and he worked in between Detroit and Los Angeles, and so he and I spent several days in New York City. And we decided we were going to go to the museum somewhere. And all of a sudden we realized we were in the middle of Harlem. And a cab driver came over and he said, "If you'll get in, I won't charge you, but I don't want you guys out here walking through here." So that was when we learned that there was ethnic differences within the city. And we had a good time there, and I got on a plane and went from New York to Los Angeles, and 62 days had gone by very quickly, and it was fantastic. Probably one of the most exciting things. One thing that was kind of interesting in Hong Kong. I don't know, you've never been to Hong Kong, but they have a cable car that goes clear up on the top of the mountain there in the center of Hong Kong is just a big island with a mountain. But up on top, there's a little restaurant up there that kind of everybody knows where it is because they do the tablecloths. They take them out and stretch them all over the parking lot area every night, and it's kind of a tradition. But anyhow, so I'm standing up there on the top of the mountain, and a guy comes over and taps me on the shoulder and says, "Keith, what are you doing here?" And it was one of my buddies from medical school in Los Angeles, and he was currently living in Hong Kong, and so. But that was kind of an unusual experience too. But, so, in answer to your question, is that detailed or is that probably beyond detail?
No, that's awesome.
Yeah,
It's an amazing story, and I'm thinking maybe me and Kevin can ask you the same question again further in the future, and we can interrupt you and ask, oh well, what did you do when you saw this, or what did you do, and so maybe we can do this again.
And on that token, of course, in thinking about it, I hadn't prepared the question. So when I was in Bangkok, which is where I have relatives now, but in those days, then I didn't. And so I was at one of the temples, and I got talking with a Pan American stewardess. You remember, I was single at this time, so anyway, the stewardess, we got talking, and I said, "Where are you stationed?" And she said, "San Francisco." And I said, "Oh, really? I'm from San Francisco." And she said, "Well, I'm really not San Francisco, but in Palo Alto." And I said, "Well, that's really, I don't live in San Francisco either. I live in Palo Alto." And she said, "Well, I'm not really in Palo Alto. I'm in Mountain View, but nobody ever even knew where Mountain View was. Currently it's Silicon Valley, but back in those days, no, it only had 3,000 people or so. Anyway, and so she said, "Well, I'm from Mountain View." And I said, "Well, actually, that's where I live too." And I said, "What street did you live on?" She said, "Latham." And I said, "Anywhere near Escuela?" And she said, "Yeah, on the corner of Latham and Escuela." And I said, "That my dad owned all that property. And we had a turkey ranch there when I was a kid. And now that when he sold it, they put apartments in." She said, "Well, I live in those apartments." And she was in Bangkok, and here we were from the same area,
Oh.
Yes, of course, as I think back on different things, I remember certain of these things. So.
Well, and that's what I'm saying. I think it would be awesome if we could do this another time in the future, and me and Kevin can kind of stop you and ask you questions about certain particular things, and then you'll kind of have those moments where you remember more and more. Okay, I don't know if you maybe want to say anything else, but I think that was wonderful. And if you don't have anything else to say, we'll just close here.
You get me talking, and you might be here all night.
Right.
Remember, I have 91 years of memories. I mean, the things that I can remember. Another thing about when I was there in Hong Kong, and they did take me on board the aircraft carrier, which was the first time I'd ever been on the aircraft carrier. And so they were going to take me down to the officers' quarters. Well, we were about 10 stories down, and they informed me that we're underwater at this point. There was just something about it. It just was not all that appealing to me.
I'm sure.
And, but it was an interesting tour. I chose not to stay there if I didn't have to. But we did have fun at the Peninsular Hotel, which is, once again, somebody asked me the other day, they said, "Did you stay at hostels and things like that?" I really didn't. I stayed pretty much 5-star hotels around there. But, I was 31 years old.
Yeah.
I was in practice, had been in practice. I had no family or anything, so I could afford. And the reason I probably went by myself is because I didn't have a lot of friends that could have done it with me.
So if anyone's around that age right now and they have the capability of doing that, would you highly recommend it?
Oh my, more than highly recommend it. Yes, I would. It was probably a life-changing experience, I mean, I've done several things that were just kind of off the cuff, I didn't plan that trip at all. I
Huh.
just went down. I said I'm going, and within a couple of weeks I was on a plane for Hawaii. But yes, I would recommend it highly. And you know, I used to go to with the Far West Ski Association every winter for a month or 6 weeks of skiing in Europe. And back then it cost me $300 to do the trip, you know, which was not very expensive. And then we would get U-Rail passes there and sleep on the train in between ski resorts and stuff like that. It was a fantastic experience too.
How much would you say that whole trip cost you around the world?
I think it was something like $4,000, $3,000, somewhere in the, between there. But you know, for my ticket, and like Hong Kong would have been a very expensive type thing, but somebody paid my way there. You know, Borneo, of course, I was free, and so my the ship tour of the Greek Isles was probably one of the more expensive things I did. So,
Well, I know this is our first video here, and I don't know if maybe we should do this every time we close, but would there be any words of wisdom that you'd like to close by talking to our viewers here?
stay young.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Alright.
just one thought, you know. But if you have to get old like me, have good health.
Yeah.
You know, and I have to say in my life, I've had a lot of really wonderful experiences in life, but I have been blessed with good health. And you could have all the money in the world, but if you don't have health, you have nothing, you know.
All
So,
right.
words of wisdom, I don't think I'm very smart, but, you know,
I think you're incredibly intelligent.
I would
One
say.
of the reasons why I want the people to see what you have
Yeah.
to say.
Yeah.
But, you know, when you say I think you're very intelligent, I think that's very interesting that people say things like that, because inside we know ourselves and we know that we're not as smart as we think we are, or as maybe other people might think we are. That's why I always ask people, you know what they call the guy that graduates in the bottom of his class in medical school?
What?
Doctor.
All right.
So my advice is, don't give up. Just keep trying, you know?
Yeah.
So,
All right, guys. I hope you enjoyed listening to Keith's story about going around the world. Join us next time.
Yeah.